Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the NSE. We had a little break, but it's really nice to be back with you all. Thank you for tuning in. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 950th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Joshua Aiken, Ellen Carroll, Joseph Zordon, Pam Lee, and Charlie Schultz. We are thrilled to welcome poet Anselm Berrigan here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from today. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Joshua Aiken is a doctoral candidate in law, history, and African American studies at Yale University and a former research affiliate at the Duke Center for Firearms Law. He is the winner of the inaugural Palette Poetry Chapbook Prize for his collection To Be and In and Of. Ellen Carroll / MEC Studios is a conceptual artist and activist who lives and works in New York City. Her career survey exhibition will open in 2025 at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, with other venues to be announced across the US, Asia, and Europe. In 2008, Carroll co-founded Do You Know Where the Children Are with Lucas Michael to address critical issues in migration and climate affecting the most vulnerable. Joseph Zordon is a doctoral candidate in the History of Art and Architecture department at Harvard University. His work examines the effectual and political afterlives of colonial violence within Indigenous and American culture, architecture, decorative arts, and painting. And Pam Lee teaches art history at Yale University. She is currently writing a book on the concept of small war and contemporary art. And our host today, Charlie Schultz, is the managing editor here at the Rail. So grateful to have you all in dialogue today, and I'll pass it over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, everyone for joining today. And thank you to all of those Critics Page contributors who could make it. I was hoping we could open the introduction by taking a quick tour through the print journal so that we could all have a collective moment to see the full scope of this Critics Page, and then we can begin discussing it. Thanks, Eleanor. I really wanted to show that because I really wanted to bring home the point that this conversation began in the pages of the print journal and is coming into the broadcast as a reinvigoration of itself. So we aren't going to just recite what happens there. We're going to talk about what happens there. And I wanted to open that discussion with Pamela's very intriguing title, Martial Intimacies, the gun and everyday militarism. And I have to admit, Pamela, when I first read that title, my mind auto-corrected it to everyday violence, but that's not what you wrote. And so I wanted to ask you about that phrase, particularly everyday militarism, what that means to you and how it became the title to this incredibly profound section.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very important question, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. When we speak about militarism versus violence, violence would seem to be the generic category in which we could understand how the military or militarism operates. I think what militarism does for my purposes is that it flags both the notion of a technology and a technics, a kind of practice and an almost rationality to how violence is conducted, reproduced, perpetuated throughout history and culture. And to say militarism as opposed to violence is also to underscore what is historically specific and what is historically contingent about that. And to bring that into line with the notion of martial intimacies is to suggest that we now inhabit a moment, and we have for a very long time, to my thinking, in which these militaristic phenomena have become domesticated, that they are in fact continuous with what we do on a day-to-day basis, and hence the gun or firearms as an absolutely critical technology in reproducing and advancing those forms of violence. So that's where I start.
And your piece ends with this concept of museumification of the gun. It was a very fascinating turn as I read it. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about that moment as well when you're in the Metropolitan and you're looking at that exhibition?
Sure. I wonder how many folks out there have actually visited or the Arms and Armor Gallery recently. It's one of the more obscure spots at the Metropolitan Museum, but it is fascinating. And it's fascinating because I think as opposed to many of the other spaces in the museum, they do seem to uphold, or at least the audiences to that part of the museum seem to imagine that there is a much more connoisseur, we could say, relationship to the artifacts on display than when we go into the other galleries and we seek out questions of context and history and social relations and so forth. When you make a tour of that part of the Met, and I can recommend it, I think it tells you a lot about audiences and museums as well. You get a real sense that the people who are populating that space know an enormous amount about these objects. And when I use the word connoisseurial, I mean to stress the sense that there's a kind of expertise around the craft and around the technology and around the production of these objects, which of course tells us very, very little about the ways in which those objects were meant to operate, in which larger contexts, who was producing them. Well, we know a little bit about that because, of course, there's always a question about the collectors and the commissioners. But clearly, the centuries and centuries of war that have enabled the advancement of this kind of technology. So an interesting field trip would be to visit the Met and to see what one can see there and to get a sense of who is paying closest attention within those spaces. It's also, I think, it was also a way for me to avoid going down the road of talking about quote unquote gun art as such, because if you page through this section, you might note that there is, relatively speaking, not an extraordinary amount of attention paid to art made about and with or for guns. Although, you know, I wonder if Joseph might say anything about that, because in some ways his piece does really important work in making these histories visible and to introduce the ways that the decorative addenda of the Colt revolver is very much not just that. It's not just an aesthetic layer on top of this artifact, but says something much deeper and much more critical, really, about what the Colt is doing at that particular moment. So maybe if you want to pull up that image and we can talk a bit about it. Yeah.
Joseph, can you take us through what we're looking at here?
Yeah,
Jordan?
absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, no, it's okay. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Pam. And so what we have here is kind of, I believe it's an 1855 broadsheet of kind of an advertisement of the Colt patent repeating revolvers. And so these objects kind of, and as I kind of outline in my piece, and I'll just do a brief summary, is it kind of, right, so Colt's first edition of the Patterson revolver kind of rises and quickly falls, but it's not until the Texas Rangers and in battle in the early 1840s kinds of reasserts the usefulness of the revolver and something that's perfected. And I think even just kind of in the things that Pam brought to us and these kinds of opening remarks, I think these kinds of scenes were interesting to me because it's not only I think the thing that's most interesting to me about these kinds of scenes, and then kind of even in this call for this piece, was just thinking about how even from their kind of inception of what we would consider a modern gun, that is a gun that can fire more than one round in a small amount of time, this more or less begins with a revolver, how even kind of with its inception, there's from at the very beginning this deep enmeshment with the marketing of racial terror, of the exportation of terror onto a racialized other. I think we're very much seeing today. And I think these whole kinds of scenes and their repeating logic and through the cylinder, which in a larger piece that is similar to this that I'd written prior played a large role. And there's just so much, so much tied up into these. And I think even Pam's kind of assertion of like the role that the connoisseur plays and how people kind of apprehend these objects, it really, I primarily would say most of my training up until this point is as a decorative arts historian, but I think there's really something about Arms and Armor and this kind of relationship to the decorative and to the way in which violence is kind of embedded within them. But of course, right, like trying to think more broadly than that. I think there was so much, even across these kinds of pieces. I think especially in Joshua's piece with its connection with the exportation of terror onto the racialized Black body, how these things are kind of, just kind of projected onto a space. A useful concept that I feel like I've been thinking about a lot has been something from the psychologist Jessica Benjamin and her kind of work in thinking about who's saved and who is kind of made discarded, who's left to be kind of absorb all of these kinds of experiences away from a body marked that is a saved body, and within the American context is often white. And yeah, sorry, it was a bit rambly, but I guess that's kind of an immediate response to some of these things.
When is the broadsheet from again? What's the date on this?
So it's the mid 19th century. So it's after, I believe it's 1855 is this particular broadsheet. And it's very much kind of at this point, Colt has been pretty stabilized in terms of its economic kind of growth. Early on, it kind of is pretty capricious in terms of its staying power. But at this point, and especially with the Colt Walker revolver, which kind of comes out of this use of by the Texas Rangers, something that Paul Chatt-Smith has written about really astutely, is that's not only right. So it's very much in line and in this time of when we see a lot of conflict between the American state, the American empire, and indigenous nations. This whole kind of idea of how does this nation kind of bring a sense of security to its white citizenry in the spite of this. And another kind of interesting aspect of this too is that around kind of in the wake of Nat Turner's rebellion, there's kind of competing, not competing, but kind of things that happen simultaneously where Samuel Colt is both said to have made the revolver to kill Comanches, as we see here, but so too something that's been kind of explored by Matt Clavin at the University of Houston, who's a historian. Samuel Colt had also been saying things such as that he was actually inspired to make the revolver following Nat Turner's rebellion, so trying to bring a sense of security to the white citizenry through a weapon like this. He wanted to arm the South against enslaved uprisings in another kind of marketing ploy. And so across kind of all these conflicts, Samuel Colt and the revolver in particular is really embedded in these kinds of logics that I think seem really prevalent in everyone's, especially this audience of Joshua and Mary Ellen's piece. Also thinking about how unaccompanied immigrant children are also embedded in this, not only in kind of their own proximity to violence, but also the way in which the US exports violence and terror, to borrow words from Joy James, onto the third world, if we're still using those words. Sorry, I hope that was.
Yeah, but I think that's important to bring up. I mean, I think also, you know, to the point about, you know, your piece and Joseph's, but also with the most recent hearings of the Supreme Court and, you know, the Bruin ruling in 2022 about historic tradition, right? This idea of how the technologies develop. So one of the things, you know, that I was also looking at is this distinction between the long and the short gun, and ways in which policy can be affected and something can actually be done. I mean, which is what I work on extensively in using policy as a material. But I think this notion of the historic tradition and how things actually evolve, both within the technology of the gun. And one of the things to be able to go into that sort of deep dive on, you know, assault weapons, right? And how they've evolved and what happened, and the you know, the papers that we were able to look at in that regard, and how, you know, the model of the Viet Cong, you know, were being used by the military. So first it was a kind of you know, examination of what the development of, you know, the arms that were coming and being used, but then as a model for these manufacturers within the US to sort of replicate or advance in some way. And that's how, you know, we ended up seeing the AR-15 and the AK and the Armalites being advanced in terms of their manufacturing and process and develop, and where we end up seeing them now today. So I think, you know, and I think, Pam, you know, you were just at that recent hearing. I don't know if you want to bring any part of that into this discussion about the policy, and then also, Joseph, I mean, you talk about this as well, and what we're seeing now, right? And Charlie, you brought this up as something that could be discussed. So I don't know if you want to jump in and introduce some of these other topics and ways in which things are being looked at.
I think there's so much to unpack here, and it's fascinating and horrifying at the same time, unsurprisingly. I think that it would be interesting to me to hang out a bit more with the notion of history and tradition, and to think about the ways in which, and here Josh is really going to be the point person, but the ways in which the law has done so much to advance, as well as obviously to catalyze, and then of course to reproduce this notion of everyday militarism. I can say, just before maybe asking Joshua to say a few words, or more than a few words, that the long and the short gun distinction that you write about so powerfully in your contribution, it made me think about, well, a number of things, one of which is that if you were to be terribly reductive about it, and I will be, so much of this, it seems to me, speaks to the ways in which the Second Amendment is so clearly framed in terms of the militia, the notion of what constitutes a militia and its relationship, of course, to a military before there was anything like a standing army in the United States, that following from that line, it is the relationship to the militia and the kind of firearms that are made possible for militia use that that seem to somehow enable what you're seeing centuries later in Texas in terms of the age for when somebody can buy a pistol versus an assault rifle, say. You know, I mean, I think about historically, it was the year after the Second Amendment was ratified that any number of laws about the access of Black people being able to join militias were put into place. And what that then says about access to firearms is that it is very, very clearly racialized. And it gets to, well, what Joseph was just mentioning in terms of how firearms technology and the laws that are themselves a kind of technology really consolidate that kind of power dynamic. So that's one way to think a little bit about the short gun, long gun scenario. We can also think about the so-called Saturday Night Special and who was allowed to purchase those in the late 19th, early 20th century versus assault rifles today. But well, there's a lot to talk about here. But maybe we should have a legal expert chime in a bit on this.
Well, I don't know if I can claim exact legal expertise,
yes, you can.
but I can provide a little bit of framing around what was being discussed in terms of history and tradition as what is the foundation for the new test that the Supreme Court has created for understanding what is viable and what's constitutional as a firearm regulation. And one of the things that I think has happened with this history and tradition test as lower courts have tried to apply it is time and time again, these courts are coming upon what they often refer to as sordid laws that are regulating firearms, but are very specific in terms of the racial project of why they are regulating firearms. And this is something that I think in using the law as a technology that enables violence and facilitates violence and is bound up in a kind of militarism that's not intended just to stay with the military or intended to stay with the militia, but actually is something to be deputized. I think Pam's point about kind of what we see in the States the year after the passage of the Second Amendment is a deputization of whiteness, more or less. And I think this kind of is a through line that is useful in understanding these different convergences that I think the pieces in this issue attend to is this way of the state providing white actors with the tools and the means and Americans kind of political economy at the base level being built upon what does it look like for the state to not just arm the military, but to arm its citizens, disarm those who are dispossessed, racialized others, and to play a role in making guns part of everyday life and make life part of an everyday militarism. And I think Pam's discussion earlier in terms of militarism, I think is very apt for thinking about this kind of long history that these pieces attend to, where you see from the colonial violence that Joseph writes about in his piece that is intended to be repetitive, iterative, almost performing a disappearing function by how quickly it allows there to not be a real scene between the person who is holding the gun and the person who is a victim, but actually a complete collapse of individuals into an amalgamation of people that are being dispossessed. And that's so much of the settler project, so much of what comes to be in the late 19th century, early 20th century, in terms of colonial violence and the state not just having its kind of formal actors, but the Texas Rangers, for example, are not, they're not the US government's kind of first line of order in terms of defining military in terms of the state, but citizens in the middle of the 19th century and white citizens collecting together in ways like the Rangers, those are the settler tool. And those folks are the ones who are able to use the literal technology and then the legal technology that allows for colonial violence and the settlement of what we now know as the US to take place. And I think that's something that's deeply connected to how we then understand the convergences of violence and where we see guns as part of making everyday life kind of a sphere where the police officer or the military officer doesn't need to be there for state-sanctioned violence to take place. What's necessary, what's important, is a kind of imaginary situation that is allowing for a citizen protector, as Jennifer Carlson puts it, to not just protect themselves, not just protect the state, not just protect kind of white settler interest, but to actually play the role of protecting all of those entities and more. And I think that imaginary is something that is very much kind of where we see Jen's points of violence now. And I think Mary Ellen's piece does a really important job of kind of connecting these different types of violence that a militarized sensibility among people creates. When you have 18-year-olds accessing these kinds of weapons, you are not working with one-off situations or one-off scenarios. You're working with a society and a legal system that are designed to facilitate certain people being able to access arms and making sure that other people are left vulnerable to harm. And I think even the short-long gun distinction, the way it's been legally regulated, has not had much to do with the types of violence it necessarily can enact, but much more with what it can do in terms of what are the interests of gun manufacturers and what are the interests of our most kind of prized citizens and consumers, which are folks who are doing the work of policing places like the border, doing that kind of work.
Josh, one of the points that I love that you brought up is about distributing harm, right? And that, these other ways that the world might be. And in talking about the distribution of harm and you raising the question about the manufacturers, right? So it's the distribution and the dissemination, right? Also of this material like we see in the video games. And we know that there are a number of cases coming up in terms of charging cases being brought against the manufacturers themselves. And is there anything that comes to mind for you right now that would be worth sharing with everybody in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think one very important thing to think about when thinking about gun laws in the United States is to take the logic of the Second Amendment and what has kind of turned into the absence of logic in terms of its interpretation and realize it's not the only thing. So I'm thinking about a 2005 law that is designed to protect firearm manufacturing. I'm thinking about the 1968 Gun Control Act, which uses the language of gun control not to speak to reducing the number of firearms or reducing the amount of harm that's caused, but control over which manufacturers are able to move weapons into the civilian population. It's about a ban on foreign imports. And so I think there's one aspect that comes to mind in terms of thinking about this is a industry. This is a industry that has been aligned with the military, an industry that has worked alongside the arming of the police and then arming a civilian population. And that being such a central feature of what the law enables and facilitates. The other thing that comes to mind are two cases filed by the government of Mexico. And these are both cases, one filed in Massachusetts, one filed in Arizona, where, as you discussed in your piece, the guns that are being used, especially in drug trafficking in Mexico, are coming from the United States, and interpersonal violence that involves guns, those weapons are so often coming from the United States. And the government of Mexico has collected a pretty substantial kind of documentation of that trade being part of what makes that possible, makes that kind of violence possible. And it's something that is facilitated and oftentimes advertised to come from the United States, go to Mexico, and kind of have harm and violence take place there, with US manufacturers having little to no responsibility for playing such a sizable role in making sure that guns are able to get in people's hands, and that there's little to no oversight that is coming from the perspective of the manufacturers. And so I think one thing for me, thinking about a world otherwise, a world unlike this one, is realizing just how successful the firearms manufacturing industry has been in shielding itself, not just from formal legal indictment, but just as much from a social imaginary and a social understanding of where harm is located and why it takes place. I think that's one of the things about guns, is that they facilitate and expedite and exacerbate the ability to harm. It's the ability of these tools and technologies to amplify violence. And I think that understanding that there's an entire manufacturing industry, sellers, buyers, connected to military contracts as well as contracts that are working with the civilian population, there's money being made and lives being lost. And those things, I think, if we're trying to imagine a world where we don't wake up to a new headline every day, or we don't see the way that colonial violence is being facilitated by the states, then it's one where we're having conversations about how those manufacturers have been shielded and are not liable in ways that really there's very few industries that kind of get the pass by the US government that the firearms industry does.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded in what you're saying of the relative gains made by people like Koskoff versus Remington to bring to light precisely these kind of manufacturing cultures, which we don't really think about too much when we talk about so-called sensible gun control and what this generically means. Yeah, and it also, and I don't want to make this Connecticut specific conversation, but it does bring to mind a history of the Northeast and the Connecticut River Valley, in which industrialization is absolutely continuous with firearms technology. And I saw somebody in the chat ask a question about art with a question mark following it, and we will get there soon, I hope. But it does strike me that as historians, when we speak about the early years of the Republic, or about what constitutes the modern within the US context, that we don't do, at least within certain areas of the humanities, we don't take as seriously the technologies and manufacture of firearms as perhaps we should. And that is, at least for me as an art historian, one of the ways to begin thinking about different histories around industrialization, and then finally mass production in the 20th and 21st century, leading us all the way up to the present and the appearance or the disappearance of the so-called ghost gun. So that's just my interjection in terms of the histories that we all need to be super conscientious about, how it is that we got here. This is very clearly a topic that feels 2023, but it is so much a topic of 1640, 1650, 1775, et cetera, that to train our eyes then on these historic manufacturers, whether a Schultz or a Whitney or a Winchester, to where we are today. That just strikes me as something that we all need to do a little more work on that.
I mean, one thing I'll just add really quickly to that point is understanding the gun as an object, and then understanding how it's been socialized into our world. And I think to the kind of the decorative elements of the Colt revolver, not being purely decorative or aesthetic, but actually illustrating and narrating what this weapon is to be used for and how it should be understood. And one thing in the contemporary world that, you know, I think feels like social psychology have done an incredible job of demonstrating is that the way that we perceive, even just seeing an object in someone's hand, and the extent to whether we're going to determine that that is a gun as opposed to something else, is incredibly influenced by race and racialization, right? There's snap judgments that make our perception of an object adjust towards those that we think are carrying weapons or carrying guns, and those that we think are already blameworthy for whatever happens with those guns. And I think that's something that is in the humanity, something that is dovetails with other ways that we've come to understand objects that are so central to folks' everyday lives, whether or not a given person is carrying a gun or not. All these scenes are being conjured of being afraid of the armed criminal at night, being afraid, going back to colonial violence, being afraid of anything West, indigenous, uncivilized, in the words of the kind of American project, that these objects are providing narratives and stories that allow for certain kinds of harm to be justified.
I think that's a really keen point. And Eleanor, would you mind bringing up that image once again of the Colt's narrative revolver? One of the things that I thought was really poignant in this image, and I think it passes through in the history and tradition and to the way that the image of the gun seems to go hand in hand in America with the image of the other. And I look at this image and I see all of the indigenous warriors running away, riding away. It's the moment of battle that I see presented here are the Texas Rangers shooting these natives in the back as if they were retreating, as if this battle was won, as if showing a double level of I don't know what to say, like power dynamics, where it's not enough that this battle has turned, but at this point we're using our advanced technology in a way that doesn't line up with the types of, you know, righteousness and dignity that goes with the kind of pop cultural mythology of warriors. I don't know. I wonder what you think about that, Joseph. Am I misreading? What do you think about that?
No, I mean, that's absolutely an aspect of the scene. And I think also just the particular battle this is representing was an exchange between a small squadron of Texas Rangers led by General Hayes And in accounts of it, it's very unclear how much of a battle it actually was. It sounds like they had actually, there had been reports that Comanche warriors were either kind of they were making kind of advancements, or were kind of doing selective justice of their own with kind of settler encroachment. And this particular band of Texas Rangers went out in search of Comanche individuals, even despite of the kind of federal government's wishes for there to be kind of, to use a term on everyone's mind at this point, a kind of ceasefire between the Comanche and the US federal government, in kind of hopes of being able to actually bring them to treaty negotiations. The Comanche were very much uninterested at this point in time. They were a fairly potent political power. And so Hayes and his men had actually more or less sought them out. They had felt that they were taunted by this kind of large party of Comanche men and warriors, and opened fired and killed dozens of them, essentially. And there was like a massive retreat. They just weren't kind of necessarily looking for a full exchange at that point in time. And so even then, kind of all these things we've been talking about of kind of, I think something that both Joshua, Mary Ellen, and Pam has kind of made me think about or bring into light again is how so much about firearms are as objects are so much embedded in a spatial logic about not only kind of encroachment, but also their proliferation and across, something that is very much a part also of industrialization and the rise of the train that we see at the same time that the Colt revolver kinds of comes into play. But there's also so much temporal aspects to this, the kind of shortening of a time, not only to travel, but also in kind of the extermination or belittling of another group's time, that kind of temporal reign also that's being deployed with something like this, and its speed and its accuracy. And I think there's so much in kind of something I feel like is really prevalent in everyone's piece is just like fear. There, it seems like there's so much a kind of understanding of how, as there's been a proliferation of these firearms and of these kind of technologies of violence, of murder, so too has there been a proliferation of fear, of an affect, of paranoia, of concern. And I don't know if there are words yet in terms of like, what do we actually do with that kind of affectual atmosphere? How do we make sense of such an atmosphere of fear? What do we make sense of all of these kinds of projects and their overlapping, where it becomes really almost overwhelming. And I think too, there's also all these other kinds of aspects of like, just as the guns barrels revolve and the scene revolves, every day we're witnessing a new kind of exchange of settler violence imparted onto another body. We've seen this from the Texas Rangers all the way until today, how these kinds of technologies persist. And I don't know. I'll leave it at that. I don't even know if I have a question, but
one of the things I think about is seeing, of course, not only the font change, but where it talks about the beware of counterfeits and the patent infringements. So already they're aware of it, right? Of what can be done and the kind of replication or duplication or this intellectual property, right, that's associated with the development of this technology. And I think, Pam, you were talking about, the ghost guns, but it's also what's happening, in 3D printing, and what can be made that won't be traceable, right? So, I mean, if you look at the degree of gun ownership, particularly in the US, it's 1 out of 3 people. And I think that, just that kind of it's an ethical horror. I mean, you can talk about it as a moral one, but it's like, what is actually happening? And how does that information or that material, and to talk about it then, I guess, in regards to the work of art, how is that made visible to people in some way that's not in insignificant, or even in where there's not any kind of substance that's related to the reality of what's actually occurring, and where there's a consciousness about that too, and it's not the responsibility of the artist to be engaged in this, because they're not experts in it as a topic. And I think but this idea of how this kind of materiality and process that comes up, and where is it actually now, and what we're actually seeing. And I think that's why, in terms of Pam, you're talking about it being like, on point, right, of this sort of current moment that that will only continue, right? It's not going to, and how it's going to continue and what we can anticipate in that regard is something that I think that we're going to see even more of with the way that these technologies actually develop and the material considerations. So not really a question, but how that evolves.
Well, I'm not sure if this is, well, I guess it's a kind of a response to your non-question, which is, I think that Tiana's contribution was very helpful, very instructive in introducing how somebody who does possess firearms and is engaged in a practice of affirmative or abolitionist self-defense might answer to what you're describing as, I think, a skepticism about how or why should artists take up this topic, to make it a kind of thematic consideration if one was to be working through questions of the social or the relationship between art and politics and so on and so forth. Because, and we've had conversations about this before, MEC, but I know that the worry is that sometimes when things get a bit too illustrative, when the gun is kind of incorporated into a work of art as a prop, that we as viewers already know the answer in advance to whatever rhetorical question has been posed. Guns are bad, gun violence bad. Well, that doesn't take you terribly far. Tiana would say, in fact, I use a gun, I practice shooting for entirely viable reasons of self-defense. I do think there are some works of art that either obliquely or maybe not, certainly not tacitly, but obliquely bring us to some of these issues in ways that are a bit more sustained, that allow us to ask questions around technologies, around proliferation, around industrialization, around the serialization, indeed the globalization of militaristic violence. So one of the artists who also contributed to the critics page is Tuan Nguyen, who in the Propeller Group, when he was in the Propeller Group quite a few years ago now, they made a rather remarkable piece called AK-47 versus M16. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it was basically a work that they made with the support of a ballistics lab, I believe in Aberdeen Proving Grounds, so a very historically important proving grounds within US history. And they were able to fire from AK-47s and some M16s, a series of rounds in which the nearly statistical impossibility of the bullets striking each other was in fact realized by engineers, and they were able to preserve this rather incredible ballistic event through gel blocks. And it's a work that for me is very important to the larger project that this critics page is a part of, because it says something about the serialization, the manufacture, and then the globalization of firearms technology. Why is it that the AK-47, the gun that won the Cold War, and now I'm just going to rehearse all sorts of platitudes, so please bear with me, the gun that won Vietnam, the gun of the child soldier, etc. What does the branding or the nationalizing, the ersatz kind of nationalizing of a firearm then suggest about where we are in 2023? We could well argue that the descendant of the M16, the AR-15, has superseded in many domains, certainly within the United States, the kind of extraordinary violence, the proliferation of violence that the AK-47 has historically represented. And there's something I find in that work, and there's certainly more, terribly enigmatic and provocative around the history of those kinds of weapons and the ways in which we are, you know, not surprisingly, still very much living with the repercussions of that war today. The war is over, so to speak. It's not, but the gun lives on. And needless to say, it's the manufacture of that gun, which took place in a war in Southeast Asia, that is now being brought home to roost within the United States and within the rash of mass shootings that we have seen over the course of any number of years. Again, not really a response to your question, or actually it wasn't a question, was it? But I think that it gets at the question about art, reproducibility, in terms that's, I think, for those of us interested in modern contemporary art, seriality, reproducibility, interchangeability, industrialization, all of these terms are very clearly in conversation with gun manufacture and its distribution and their distribution.
Something, this has nothing to do with that, but something that has popped into my head was Chris Burden's Shoot.
Yes.
And where, you know, where that gets located even. I mean, we don't have to go into it, but
Well, Tuan has this fantastic piece that's a kind of coda to that, which is that as a Vietnamese diasporic artist and as a student at UC Irvine and then Cal Arts, he actually asked Chris Burden, he wrote him a letter and asked Chris Burden to re-perform that gesture on him. Surprisingly, it never happened, but it was a bit of a fabulous tale about how can we update these sort of performances of gun violence in the present, relatively speaking.
I had one more thought that I wanted to bring into the conversation before we move to the question and answer segment with our audience. And that was this idea of hopefulness, or the idea that this might not all be a foregone conclusion to fear, terror. And what I thought was interesting was that in Joshua's piece and Mary Ellen's piece, this sense of hopefulness is paired with poetry. Joshua quotes from Gwendolyn Brooks. Mary Ellen tells a story about discussing a poem with unaccompanied immigrant children. In each case, there is a beat of hopefulness, or the idea that maybe there's another side or another possibility. So I wanted to ask Josh and Mary Ellen to speak about poetry, why you put it in your pieces, the idea of hope. Yeah.
Josh, do you want to go? Well,
sure, I can start.
Yeah.
I was very sure that I wanted to include Gwendolyn Brooks's words in this piece, and from the poem Paul Robeson, in thinking about what it means to take Black lived experience and understand the social and political possibility that comes from listening to and attending to the circumstances of what that means. And in the essay, I talk specifically about losing 2 of my cousins to gun violence, and then additionally, at the same time, the Project the Carceral State losing other Black men to the carceral system, having years taken away from them and their families' lives. And that those conditions that sow and are intertwined with kinds of fear, kinds of anxiety, kinds of stress that stays in people's bodies forever, it produces or makes possible results that we might not expect, ways of being that we might not anticipate. And one of the things in the essay that I think is very much related to poetry is, what can we make from understanding and hearing those lived experiences, and what kind of worlds do people already make? And I think so much of Black culture, and more broadly, so many kind of cultural projects that have come from different Black arts movements show, and I think Paul Robeson as an artist showed this as well, is this desire to say, how can we understand anti-Blackness as something that tries to do the work of individuating at the same time as denigrating collectively, and instead have an affirmative project that is a completely different world that imagines us entangled, and imagines a we that is deeply invested in the ways that there is no individual project that can really attend to the making of a world otherwise. And I think that's poetry's one of its most kind of apt elements in terms of imagining worlds that could be and that may not be here yet, but thinking about being each other's magnitude and bond, as Gwendolyn Brooks puts it, it demands that we understand and see harm and violence that is being facilitated by objects like this as our own, as something that we're bound up in, something that is entangled. And I think that poetry reminds us often to attend to the place and time where we are and the world in which we're in. I think each poem is an event, and I think understanding that poems give us an entry point, and in this case, I think a really important entry point into understanding a we that is mobilized against the world as it is, the world as we see it, and the role that guns play in making and unmaking worlds in the present.
Joshua, that's exactly what I was thinking about too, is this we, right? The collective, as you also mentioned, versus the need to individuate, right? And I think that one of the things with, in the piece, Welcome to America, I mean, as I referenced that I was with a group of unaccompanied immigrant children. Children goes all the way up to 18, so sometimes people don't think as teenagers as that. But in that point of talking about, the border and the violence there, but also, what happened in Uvalde, which I really didn't have an entry to until we attended that performance there, where we saw Balafruta, Jesus Vales's work that anthropomorphizes a bullet as it goes through all these mass shootings. and how that bullet can continue. But the one thing too is that, you know, in the discussion at that corner after the performance, that it was, you know, it was a critique about the sort of narrative and how personal and individual it was, and not the experience, you know, of these incredibly, you know, courageous kids who have been forced to make this unbelievable journey, as many people have and continue to do throughout the world. But I think to go back, you know, to the sort of discussion about poetry, because it was a theater piece, but Jesus is a poet as well, is that it's the sort of temporal consideration of it, and, you know, how things get slowed down and are made visible and audible to us. And that's something that I think, you know, art does, of course. And I think having, you know, this kind of opportunity, as, you know, Pam presented to all of us to participate in, and everybody did it in their own way, but collectively to think about this, and how actually complementary the pieces are to one another, even though they also distinguish themselves. And that I think it's necessary to act. Like it's, I don't know if that's something that translates to being hopeful, but I think that it's essential that we actually do it. And, you know, how to participate and to affect is something that distinguishes us, right, as human beings. So, Charlie, I don't know if that.
Yeah, I completely hear what you're saying. The distinction between the individuation and the group. And oh gosh, Joshua, I had myself on mute because I kept just yelling into this apartment how much like I really, yeah, your words struck me deeply. Thank you. Thank you everyone for participating. I really am moved by the conversation, and I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for audience members to also engage and to hear our poet. So I will hand it back over to Eleanor. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Charlie. And yeah, thank you so much to Josh and Joseph and Mary Ellen and Pam and Charlie, of course. It's been a really amazing conversation, and I feel, yeah, I'm really grateful to hear from all of you. We do have some questions for the Q&A. So our first question today will be from Fong.
Thank you so much, Josh, Pamela. Wow, what a guest critic page. Thank you, Joseph and Mary. It's just amazing. As I have so much question, I usually be the last, but I have to leave for a meeting. So I grew up, as you know, during the war in Vietnam. And many of families, both sides, has been victims. And I grew up also have shot many times, both guns, the M16 and AK-47. All I remember is that M16 was lighter, at least 30% lighter. And my question relating to all of this, just because our late friend Polivirio had passed away in September 2018, we held a gathering to celebrate his work. And we all remember how amazing that publication was, Speed and Politics, published in 1977. And it's all related, again, that I did not realize, but it was, in fact, Mussolini who was so impressed by the Futurist Manifesto, as you remember, that were published because Marinetti had bought the front page of Le Figaro, and that was published in 1909, but he read it, he saw it, and he was a young aspiring journalist of Avanti magazine. Do you remember, in Milan? He was a young aspiring socialist writer. We've also forgot, you guys, that Benito is not an Italian name that was given to him by his socialist parents, hardcore Socialist Party member, who were admirers of Benito Juarez, giving him that. But nevertheless, he was so impressed by the manifesto, you know, and he essentially enrolled himself to the army to meet Marinetti. So speed, violence, and everything else is part of Paul's entire life dedicated to study speed. So in regard to speed, again, I couldn't believe it. But the term cowboy was meant to be a bad term. Cowboy meant people who stole cattle and all kind of horses and resell them to butchers, you know, but it's been romanticized. It's been romanticized as it did with the OK Corral shooting in Tombstone, Arizona, 1881. And during the Trump presidency, I have gone back to look at that incredible violent history. And the romanticization of it is what really horrified me, Pamela. You know, Josh and Joseph and Mary here and Charlie, everyone here. Because I remember sitting in a bar with Leon Garland and Nancy Sparrow when the bombing of Baghdad occurred. You remember? And that was sometime in late March 2003. And we realized how all the images that appear on the television, Fox News, CNN, and elsewhere, are the same. It had identical vantage point. It's somewhere celebratory, like a 4th of July, and a little bit of referencing Turner's, you know, the burning of the House Parliament.
Yeah.
Incredible. So I was asking myself and other friends, related friends, I wonder whoever orchestrated that, knowing that Bush's father had been a CIA director, and whether he talked to his son not to allow photojournalists to come up close to that was happening. So it dropped away all the horror like it did during the Vietnam War. So all we see is just this picturesque, nearly sublime kind of control perception. So what's my question? My question is like, it's amazing how that got into this incredible sense of control in terms of, you know, the larger picture of the mainstream media. So that's my question, really. How do we know what degree to which that get controlled so much? I mean, even today, what we experience right now, between social media, what get deployed in a certain way. In Ukraine, we know it's young people who have been previous teenager who now brought that technological know-how, you know, to the forefront. Certainly could help the military to deploy drone warfare and intelligence, you know, service and whatnot. So where we are today with that in mind, you guys, you know, how is that being mediated? Pamela, can I ask you first?
Do I understand that you're asking about the spectacle of violence?
Yes.
And the ways that this is obviously a function or continuous with this issue around, yeah, my goodness. Well, I'm not sure how much I want to go into this, but it was a rather fascinating, which is maybe not the right word. It was a fascinating / dispiriting thing that happened a few weeks ago when I believe it was the Washington Post decided to publish images from Sandytown. I believe that was the Post. Mary Ellen Carroll, is that correct? Yes. Okay. The spectacle. Yes. And there was, as one can imagine, a great deal of editorial qualification about why one would want to do just that, because it's a debate that is almost as old as the history of photography itself, which is, does the image of violence, and in this case, gun violence, what does it actually produce or reproduce at the point of reception? Does this actually lead to people to the kind of action, the kind of activity that we heard about just a moment ago in MEC's position, or does it in fact simply anesthetize us to yet more violence? I think that's where you're going with this. The reference to Baghdad strikes me as one in which the spectacle of violence does indeed take on a kind of sublime quality. I'm thinking about, I believe it was a work by Louise Lawler X number of years ago, which featured, I can't remember what missile, and she had just wrote over it in very plain or very beautiful kind of cursive script, something like beautiful, something like that. And that is indeed a part of our inheritance as well in the United States, as both students and thinkers around visual culture and art history, which is how do we parse the distinction between the circulation of these images as so much spectacle, or how do we take them on in ways that allow us to think and work critically with the phenomena at hand, and not perhaps mechanistically or in a manner that might fall into the trap of the sort of mechanistic representation of guns within the media. All guns bad. Gun violence, yes, it's bad. But so what do we do with that? That's not really an answer to your question, but I do think that it frames why this is a huge part of the problem as well, especially with social media, and especially as well with AI's capacity to create the kind of imagery that would seem only to exacerbate the phenomena you're describing.
No, that's perfectly answered. Thank you, Pamela. Josh or Marianne, you have anything to add? But I'm very satisfied with that answer alone. Thank you, Pamela. Back to you, Eleanor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fong, and thanks, Pamela, for that response. Our next question is going to be from GE, and if anyone else would like to ask a question, please feel free to send a message in the chat or raise your hand. For now, over to you, GE.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Fong. Thank you, Charlie and panel, for this discussion. This has been giving me so many different ideas and so many different places I never knew we could go there, but it's good. Can all this be seen as a kind of industrial manifest destiny, which also is paired for this notion of the preparedness for violence?
I would say yes. I would say that what's the complement of that, the manifest destiny part, is obviously the interests of racial capitalism, which are so foundational to the beginnings of the Republic. And industrialization, the whole history of guns and enlightenment, to borrow from the scholar Ken Alder, it's kind of baked into how we understand what constitutes revolutionary politics from the time of the 18th century to the present. And the history proceeds, at least on the industrial part, by fits and starts. You have a very famous scenario, some of you might be very familiar with this history, but a scenario in which Thomas Jefferson, as the minister to France, is introduced to an engineer by the name of Honoré Blanc, who shows him the logic of what was called, or what became to be known as, interchangeability. That is to say, how to reproduce the parts of a gun so that the exacting tolerances between different parts of the gun fit together perfectly, and how then you can reproduce the gun over and over and over again in order to wage the wars that one does. This then follows, Jefferson is deeply impressed by this. He brings it to the United States, introduces the concept to Eli Whitney, who markets it after the failure of the cotton gin. He markets this concept of interchangeability, is never able to achieve the exacting mechanics that's required of it. But then that goes on down the line to be a part of the whole industrial process, as I think you know, from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century and beyond. And we would want to be careful as historians not to conflate necessarily this early history of industrialization with mass production as such, but there is something about the ideology and the ethos that is necessary to advance and to make possible both the political as well as manufacturing will that brings us to this point in the present. That really impels us to think about that relationship very early on within the 18th century between nation building, empire, racial capitalism, and the modern gun. So Manifest Destiny would certainly be a part of that. And I'm sure that Joseph might have something to say about that as well.
I mean, just kind of quickly, I think something that I've been thinking about not only when I was writing the piece, but also even in the course of this conversation, is just kind of maybe the importance of bringing a certain aspect of what I see as my own piece as kind of invisible text, or the thing I didn't write but was trying to say, was essentially that the frontier as a space becomes reproducible everywhere, essentially, as long as there is this kind of these encroachment of forces that we're talking about, whether it be racial capitalism, and which becomes right folded into all these processes of industrialization and so on and so forth. And so I think it's entirely entangled with that, and it's also just something that's essential to the history of the revolver, as kind of one of the real American inventions or guns, whatever that may mean, is its own very early usage of early industrialization, of having plants of mass manufacture. Well, not mass manufacture, but extensive manufacturing of these kinds of technologies that, as we're talking about, proliferate, and bring with it this whole kind of imagery of the frontier, manifest destiny, and the desires that are inherent in such objects, that are become inherent in such objects. And of course, right, there's always kind of conflicting things too. Indigenous people get revolvers, and all these other kinds of histories too are 100% enmeshed in this. They're still, even from their inception, embedded in other forms of resistance. But I think it's also always the dance of how you hold those kinds of, I don't want to say competing histories, but histories that are presented as at odds with each other. How do you hold those at the same time? But no, absolutely. Thank you.
I'll just add one thing quickly in terms of, I think, this notion of manifest destiny and how it really is brought into the 20th century, kind of moving from, I think, what Pam pointed out in terms of interchangeability being kind of core to the technology of firearms, and then the logic of what it will look like to mass produce. But then the mass proliferation of small concealable handguns in the 1950s and the 1960s, in part response to the civil rights movement, and in part a response to the spatial dynamics of racial capitalism in the United States, where it's who lives in what neighborhood and who needs to have a handgun to be defending themselves, their home, their property. And so I think this goes to Joseph's point in terms of there is a real spatial element to what is created when the frontier can be anywhere. And I think that is part of what the mass proliferation of small handguns that can be put on your hip really creates. Is we move into the 20th century and you can bring technology of the frontier, a technology of war, and a technology that is what maintains a racial order and a racial capitalist order. You can bring that wherever you want. I mean, that's one of the things that the Supreme Court is really facilitating at this point. Is an armed individual means an individual who can carry a technology that has so many scenes attached to it that are bound up in a settler empire project, and that's part of what's happening when handguns proliferate and get us to the point where we have more firearms than people in the United States.
Thank you so much for that question, GE. And thanks for all of your responses. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding with a poetry reading. And today I'm so thrilled to welcome Anselm Berrigan to the virtual stage. Anselm Berrigan is the poetry editor for the Brooklyn Rail and author of a number of books of poems, most recently Pregrets from Black Square Editions. Anselm, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks, everybody, for the talk. My poems just fell off my desk, so hold on a quick sec. Okay. I've done this reading at the end of the talk a few times, and it's always interesting to try to figure out along the way what's going to actually work there at the end, given the content and nature of the conversations. And it's possible. I'm gonna read 3 poems that I think are each hopefully doing different things, and 2 of them are mine, and I'm going to read 1 poem by my mother, Alice Notley.
Yeah.
And this oh
No, I was saying hey.
oh okay. Okay, this is my poem. It's called In Betweener. Actually, I'm not going to read that poem. I'm going to read this poem. It's called Self.
Anselm,
What?
your audio just sounded like you jumped into the ocean for a moment.
Oh.
But it sounds better now. Okay. Sorry to interrupt. I think it should be working. Try. Maybe start over.
All right. I did jump into the ocean. Okay. I wonder about the quiet students, don't we all? In that generation gap I experience within for myself, I am the perpetual blank of a present student self, slowly making awareness come to bleed. I ain't got time to bleedeth inherent tears of assertion going laterally forward. It's disdain for labels in anarchy class, cancel or delete. In the case of Afghan wigs, it's like I located some timing of the funky so what vein, and then Dana told me he was always doubtful on Dooley, so maybe my slobject is to rehear all of 1993. I left a doppelgangrene there. Today, in Zooms of our lives, everyone froze except me, not long after no one could hear me. It was a lot like 1987 and being 15. I wondered, pigeon just landed behind me, orange-eyeing my setup, if it was in time for the post-ghost to appear in countertime. I'm still wondering. Had an all-expression and eye-lines conversation in person today. It was this rare bird thing, an absolute admission of love by the last bookstand in Manhattan. Presence is the establishment of listening's practice. Gotta think about that. Even if you only think in the gnarly future's end makes way for. As a quiet student learning how to learn all the time, I hate what teaching does to me and my personal irony. Soon, which is a money problem, I will never let anyone put me in charge of again. Assassinated. Line like this recalls us to surface, swallowed by the compositional machine, drenched in civic sweat. Dude across the bench says he's a math person who wasn't taught right. Okay. It was weird to be fake assassinated by a poet at a place called Bard. It was fake theater and fake poetry and fake puppetry and fake video game satire and nothing. Death was nowhere, and the toy rifle shot fast. Maybe that's what the goose thinks, being stuffed and petted at the same slime. I was accused in a letter disfigured as an email of conspiring with trans painters to create a new symbolism. Really? At least grant me the fake desire to reinvent cubism or photorealism or some other movement from the actual fucking Paleolithic century I was supposedly born during. The unknown is not scary, Mr. Stranger. Imagine testing truths while pretending getting a master's degree is the equivalent of Guernica or being registered in the pose of ordinary agony. Dog, why? It was amazing to see so many people fail to even give the shrug. But that's cool. The story's so modular and bonkers it sounds fake itself on any kind of repeat. In my autobiography, which I will never write, this will all be outsourced as blame to deep imagism's stylized and resonant tribe of cloned rabbits. You can look it up, as old Case used to supposedly say. I have to do at least 5 more things to this poem. Got stymied today when asked if I felt 100%. 100% of what? Who cares that it makes breezes? This table turns out to be reserved for an event. I should have quit and left after the fake shooting happened, but I had to introduce the next poet. Talk about being overly professional. You can run in circles as mode of performance disguised as resistance, or you can join the track team. I wonder, Brad, how Jerome Solo would finish this poem. Would he admit to having been co-captain of the track team in high school and then co-chair of a so-called discipline at graduate art school? Unlike everyone the world claims to be exposing us to, I think the future is terrific. Just please put everything in the wrong order. Some ones were sitting here and one of the ones showed a poem on the phone to the other one, and I only know this because the other one said, I like the rhythm of the first stanza, but I don't like the second stanza. And so sitting here rereading a chapter on Pablo Picasso never got called an asshole's Guernica, I decided to finally write underneath the title Fake Assassinated. Fuck periods at the ends of lines. No one noticed. That's cooted grebe. I told myself I'd only go back to the Bard place for $50K and an apology. Turns out $5K and help was enough. Please kill me again. Love, Anselm. My email is anselmberrigan@aol.com if you want the background on that. And this is a poem by my mother, Alice Notley. It's from a book of hers called Mysteries of Small Houses. And it is titled September 7th / August 29, 88. And it has to do, as you'll hear, with her brother, my uncle's experience as a soldier in Vietnam. And I'm based on hearing things today, I decided I should read this. It's not an easy poem to read or listen to, but here we go. We get out of the car and I think I see him. He waves coming from a woods. Looks like our dad, shape of head and current slenderness, mustache, is wearing dark glasses. Hugs. There's only going to be gladness at seeing each other. We go in the lobby of rehab Margaret and I get visitors tags. Girl asks if we're twins. Al has to give up our birthday presents for him. He says he can't stand to be inside. We climb a hill and sit down on a bench. Occasional interchanges with other patients who walk or jog past. Mostly we talk about Vietnam, some about our family. In the afternoon, we've left and come back with Fred. We sit in a meadow, same subject matter, some of the same stories. I'll fuse them. In the morning, he was shaky, but not in the afternoon. I come back up here all the time. They know where to find me, even if I'm not supposed to be here, so it's okay. It's just like Nam, but we'd hear crickets all night there. I hated them. The nights were terrible. Every night. I never wanted it to be night, just day. The tank story. He's in Quang Tri. Usually he's the gunner, but today, for an unremembered reason, the driver. There's something called white phosphorus, which he's so scared of that he always fires it off first to get rid of it. Today's gunner doesn't. What happens is a shell drops into the small top opening of the compartment where the gunners are. Albert hears their screams and knows everyone is frying from white phosphorus. He goes for the escape hatch on the bottom, but it won't open for long, long seconds. Finally, he gets out. Everyone else is dead, of course. This is the subject of his most long-standing nightmare and first point of guilt, this escape. I thought I'd be safe in a tank, but after that, I didn't want to get in one again. We asked him how he became a sniper. They came around asking for volunteers. They said, "You're a volunteer, and you're a volunteer." I was a good shot, good with guns. They thought I was good. I wanted to be outside, so they sent us down to sniper school. The snipers would go in ahead, take a village, then others would follow. Snipers had to kill civilians, and it started to seem like murder. I must have killed 49 or 50 civilians. You see a mama-san with a baby, you shoot first and ask questions later. She might be carrying explosives. But they wouldn't count the civilians in their body count. They only wanted the NVA. They'd ask if you got any, but wouldn't write it down. Al witnessed executions by the Phoenix program. They'd come in after we took a village. They had a list of people to kill. They'd pull up their hair and shoot them in the head. They'd put down, say, the mayor of a village that was sympathetic to the communists, but you could also bribe them to kill someone in your business you disliked. The Phoenix program was CIA affiliated. Later in Needles, Dickie Roten confirms that Albert was in the LRR and a lot of what he did was top secret. He has a double record, one with blanks. Al thinks that at a certain point he was supposed to die because he knew too much about the killing of civilians, Operation Phoenix, and so on. Members of his sniper unit stopped ever coming back from missions. Everything everyone was sent on was incredibly dangerous. Then we went into Laos. The fighting never stopped. The Vietnamese army was supposed to show up, but they never did. I got left back with 150 men. If you were left back, it was pretty much assumed you would die. Finally, everyone was dead except for me and this other guy. We decided there wasn't any sense in staying since everyone else was dead. We went back to Quang Tri. It took about 7 days, around 30 miles walking involved. They caught fish and ate them raw. He didn't know the guy he was with and never saw him again. When I got back, they were getting ready to send out an MIA to Mom and Dad. They sent me instantly into North Vietnam. Then I knew they wanted to be rid of me. I think this is when Albert Trujillo was killed. Albert Trujillo was Albert's best friend in Vietnam. He was from New Mexico. He and Albert had sworn to keep each other alive. NB, our dad, also named Albert Notley, had a best friend named Albert Trujillo in Prescott when he was Albert's age. But Al's friend Albert was killed because their sergeant was too slow and scared to cover him. He let it happen out of fear. Albert held a gun then to the sergeant's head and told him, "If you say one word." Albert brought the body bag back. The last thing he remembers from North Vietnam is shooting in a circle all around himself. He got picked up by a chopper, went back to Quang Tri, but it had fallen, makes his way down to the south, and is eventually shipped home. I love my brother so much this visiting day, but wonder if he doesn't know too much to live. He's been remembering and remembering. The therapists want him to remember even more, but he doesn't want to. He wants to go home and see his kids. I wonder how he can have a future. I want to be able to sit around some kitchen table with him, but can't picture that. I wonder if he could be the way he was, happier and lighter, before he started remembering. But I don't think so. He emanates too much knowledge, power. His self is huge, bigger than any I've ever witnessed. His boundaries are too painful and too small. They keep him where he remembers. They keep his knowledge concentrated, personal. He must get free of this self now, but I don't know how he will. Yet escape's fated, written already. We all know it and don't know it. He made it a few weeks. Thanks. Actually, I should just say I heard my mother read that poem out loud the first time I ever heard it. And I didn't know most of what was in it. And it was really shocking. And I asked her once, years later, why she didn't read that poem more often at readings. And she said, I don't want to exploit it. So I thought this was the right context to read that in. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anselm. That was a really beautiful special reading. I think it was a perfect way to conclude the conversation today. And just a huge thanks again to Josh and Mary Ellen and Joseph and Pam and Charlie, and also all the other contributors to the critics page. But thanks to you all for the really, really wonderful conversation today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program, and also support our archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. For the past 23 years, we've been a platform for arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events. And now we would love some help to keep the rail free. We are fundraising $200,000 this season to directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and operations for the coming year. So please check the link in the chat to support our work here at the Rail and help us meet our goal. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Bethany Collins and Amanda Gluibisi on the event of Undercurrents at Alexander Gray Associates. We will conclude with a reading by Riel Bello. And also, I see in the chat, Anselm is reading on Saturday at Artist Space for the Segway series with Kit Robinson. So if you're around, definitely go check that out. And thanks to you all for tuning in today. You can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Mary
Ellen.
and everybody. Yep, thanks.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Pamela.
Really incredible writing. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mary and Ellen.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Anselm.